and Sterile Endoscopes, a new series from Beyond Clean, where we dive into the seismic shifts redefining endoscope reprocessing today. It's hosted by me, Hank Balch. In this series, we'll unpack groundbreaking innovations, sterilization standards, and best practices transforming patient safety in real time. With insights from industry experts and frontline champions, we're here to help you navigate the complexities of endoscope reprocessing and sterility. This series is proudly sponsored by ASP, Advanced Sterilization Products, protecting patients during their most critical moments. And now, sit back and stay tuned for an eye-opening journey into the future of endoscope safety. All right, we're back today, episode 5 of the Safe and Sterile Endoscope series here on the Beyond Clean Network, sponsored by ASP. And today we're going to be talking about regulatory guidelines, updates, shifts that we're seeing in the industry. And I got some terrific guests with us today in studio to cover those topics. Maybe first we'll start here with Stacy Johnson, the clinical education consultant with ASP. You're also an advanced practice nurse. Stacy, welcome to the show today. Can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and kind of how you got into the industry?
Thank you. My background was operating room nursing, and from there I became a clinical nurse specialist, and in that role as an advanced practice nurse, I really partnered with sterile processing and endoscopy departments. Overall quality, safety for patient care, but evidence-based practice was really the basis of my role in these healthcare systems. And I did that for 2 healthcare systems in Minnesota before I came to ASP.
Okay. I got a feeling evidence-based is going to come up once or twice in this conversation today. So I'm glad you have that background there, Stacy. Welcome. Let's go next to Melanie Marshall, clinical education consultant on the Canadian side over there. You're a registered nurse. And yeah, what's your background, Melanie? How'd you get into this conversation today?
Well, I've been a nurse for over 20 years. My bedside practice was in the intensive care unit mostly. And I started teaching back in 2010. So I've been a teacher for longer than I've been a nurse, to be honest, at the bedside. So I started teaching nursing. In the last few years, I started teaching for an endoscope manufacturer. And now here I am as the clinical education consultant for ASP Canada.
Wonderful. Yeah. Well, welcome both. Really excited to talk to you today. I know we were talking before we started the interview. The backgrounds around standards, they're complex as it is. And then you add in an international component and it makes it even more complex and interesting. So I'm really looking forward to jumping into the conversation here. I say guidelines, but there's actually a number of different categories of these documents that, sometimes we use kind of shorthand. We say guidelines or standards or whatnot. Maybe let's start there. As you're educating clinicians and starting to introduce them to this conversation around documents out there that impact what they do and how they handle devices inside the clinical setting, how do you differentiate or define the guidelines versus the recommendations versus the IFUs versus evidence-based practice? Maybe, Stacy, we'll start with you. How would you kind of lay all that out?
Well, I think first of all, many of us who are working in specific practice areas are familiar with the guidelines or standards, as you said, in our own department. And so, for example, operating room was where I started. And so AORN was at that time it was called recommended practices. And over time, they have changed their terminology and to guidelines. So the AORN guidelines. But, working then with sterile processing, at that time when I first started, AAMI ST91 was the big standard that we were using for steam sterilization, and really that document that we went to for, again, that evidence-based practice. And so, the fact that you have these groups of industry experts who are they come together to review current research and discuss best, practices and make those recommendations in these formal documents. So when you're working to define policy and procedure, in your department, that's usually where you're going to want to have some sort of evidence-based back, standards or guidelines. And so AAMI standards, see in the sterile processing department, but then now we're talking about endoscopy. So then we have to kind of open our mind to the fact that we've got partners now in the GI labs or endoscopy departments that are looking at SGNA, which is the Society for Gastroenterology Nurses and Associates. So that they have their own standard of infection prevention for reprocessing endoscopes. So that's, SGNA then is going to have a slightly different take because they're coming from the gastroenterology world and really looking at it from that flex semi-critical devices, right? So there's a different emphasis. And then they also have the GI doctors, a multi-society guidelines, the gastroenterology. They have put other guideline out, which outlines, best practice standards around reprocessing endoscopes, so flexible endoscopes. So you have all these different groups that are putting forward these guidelines or standards of practice. And so your regulatory agencies are really going to look at what are you using to back up your practices and your policy and procedures. So this is where that concept of multidisciplinary groups comes together as you maybe, especially as we were talking about endoscopy, we're starting to talk about what's going to be the best practices in our facility? Do we need to make changes? Are we going to include sterile processing in the reprocessing practices, procedures in our facility? This is where you come together and start looking at that. And I think that, all of them are going to give you, because they're based on evidence, the research, the current research, you are going to see the similarities in that, cleaning of endoscopes is going to start with point of use pretreatment. Might not be called pre-treatment in each document, but that point of use pre-cleaning, into a leak test, manual cleaning, and, you're going and high level disinfection or sterilization. You're going to see those steps outlined in all of those guidelines.
Right. And, that's for the U.S. side of the conversation. Obviously, Melanie, there may be some other organizations or documents on the Canadian side that y'all add to that list. I guess maybe start by explaining what those other ones are, but then also can you connect, for international listeners, how do you leverage documents maybe that are not your nation's documents, but they still have impact on your day-to-day practice?
Mm-hmm. So just like Stacy had mentioned before, we also kind of have the same typical bodies of panels of experts, except there's just the Canadian version of them. So they usually have a little C in front of them. So we have CSGNA, we have IPAC, we have ORNAC, and we don't follow the AAMI standards, but what we do follow are our national standards, which are written by CSA, which is the Canadian Standards Association. And that's what we really follow as a primary set of standards and guidelines.
All right. Yeah. So we were speaking right before the interview. At the date of this recording, a CAMDAR event just happened up in Canada. And what's really interesting, to your point, Melanie, is a lot of these speakers and presenters that are speaking at CAMDAR are also presenting in the U.S. at similar conferences, or they're sitting on these various organizations that you just mentioned, with the alphabet there. It's all cross-pollinating because the fundamental science side of all this, right, does not change from country to country. We're fighting the same bugs. We got the same devices. Fundamentally, it's the same, even though there are very important differences with what the recommendations are, from manufacturers to the clinical side, to the regulatory oversight side too, that Stacy alluded to. So really important insight there, though, as we talk about, both of these countries solving the same problem with different documentation, different organizations that are representing them. Let's talk about FDA, and maybe Melanie will start with you because, the U.S. FDA might be a little bit different with the impact it has, if any, on what y'all are doing there in Canada. But, there's been recent FDA communications and recommendations around endoscope reprocessing, primarily responding to gaps and issues that we've seen out there on the user side. So how has that impacted what you're seeing up there in Canada today?
Just to reiterate, so the FDA plays a really important part on a global level. So I've seen the FDA cited in multiple, Australian standards as well, and they all kind of cite each other. So even the European nations, they cite Australian standards and they bring in the FDA and the CDC and all sorts of really important white paper articles that have been put out there and amazing recommendations. I have to say that this type of information does get shared. And if we do look at these standards and practices, well, the first rule of thumb is that we all follow the MIFU. So, the manual instructions for use are the ones that really set the steps first, and everybody kind of works around that. So if we look at international laws, they shouldn't differ really from country to country too much. And then you got to think as well, there's these, governing bodies that encompass international standards like the WHO or the World Gastroenterology Organization, and ISO. Those are all standards that are international that everybody tries to follow as well. And of course, national guidelines are going to differ because it depends on their federal laws or their environment, access to technologies, their personnel, what they can handle.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. So Stacy, Melanie brings up an important point, and I'll add a little nuance here. You got manufacturers also that are, selling into the U.S. market that are selling internationally as well. And so if it's the scopes we're talking about, or if it's the cleaning or the sterilization devices that are reprocessing the scopes, they're selling both in the U.S. and many times all other countries around the world. And yet, when the FDA sends out communications and recommendations, that has impact both here in the U.S., but also globally, to Melanie's point. So how have you seen that in the U.S. market? Like, what's the FDA saying about endoscope reprocessing currently? And then how is that changing the way that we're addressing some of these challenges?
Well, in the last several years, the FDA has been putting out these safety alerts, and specifically around endoscopy reprocessing. And so, following infections that were, especially with multi-drug resistant organisms that made the headlines, impacting patient safety, became more, I think, more awareness within the public and in the healthcare industry overall. Since that time, the FDA has done a lot of work around, of course, we have a lot of research, as we mentioned earlier, going on, but again, convening their groups of experts to review. And they also have then put out their own safety alerts here. And so, for example, early on, it was specifically with the duodenoscopes or endoscopes that had the elevator channel mechanism because they were challenging to clean. And this was implicated in these multi-drug resistant organisms that were then transferred. They were contaminating the scopes, and the cleaning process was challenging. So immediate, response to that was looking at the design of those endoscopes, but also then, of course, reviewing the process, all the processes. And so, FDA put out safety warnings around the endoscope, those elevator channels, specific cleaning, and that had to be done around those for patient safety. And then from that point, there has been updates to those FDA safety alerts. And the FDA is encouraged, of course, then reporting, medical device reporting, which then they're collecting those reports from organizations if there is an indication that either endoscope reprocessing may have possibly been implicated with it for an infection, or, it's a report that's been some sort of contamination that was reported. And the FDA has actually identified then high-risk endoscopes. So not just your duodenoscopes, but also urology, endoscopes, and bronchoscopes. So there have been FDA safety alerts on those as well. So for organizations, not just in hospitals, but working within clinic settings where they've had maybe these specific practices using, urology scopes or bronchoscopes. And of course, then these endoscopes are used like in the hospitals, not just in procedural areas, they end up getting used all over the hospital as well. So FDA putting out these alerts, then again, is for the high-risk endoscopes. Again, that needs to be, it's a way of trying to communicate, wow, we have this this is the information that we have right now. So we need to put that information out to the public and really make an emphasis so it kind of gets out to everybody. Again, what the FDA has emphasized is, as we were talking about, strict adherence to manufacturers' instructions, right? Have to make sure that we're doing everything correctly. You want to make sure that you're educating your teams, that they're, able to, the whole competency idea, that education around cleaning endoscopes. And then the fact that, they've been collecting this evidence from their database, and it shows, they'll report the number of safety incidents that have been reported. And so it kind of gives you this full review of where you need to be in the current state of things. And they've also, as I said, they've updated. So as the duodenoscopes, one of the things they recommended in 2020 is start planning a transition to endoscopes with disposable components, whether it's end caps or disposable. And that now has evolved into their most recent update, which was you should be transitioning to those models. They're available, for those endoscopes with the elevator channels. But also, like with the endoscopes, the urology endoscopes and your bronchoscopes and any of the scopes used with respiratory, many of those endoscopes can be sterilized. So again, the FDA putting out there that, sterilization is an option. And so high-level disinfection being a minimum standard, moving into sterilization if possible.
Right. On the regulatory push, obviously, as you mentioned, Stacy, there's been a number of these publications out from FDA saying, hey, you need to pay more attention to this. Hey, there's other options out here. As we know, unfortunately, in the industry, we wish it didn't take government entities to come in and say, you got to change, you need to change. We wish that many times these changes would happen by themselves based on data and clinician feedback. But either way, the government comes in and it's a good push in the right direction to say, okay, it's not an option really anymore. Now we need to start making some changes. And Melanie, I'm curious, obviously, as this pressure starts happening from the government side, it does impact the regulatory, the accreditation process, the auditing process. So how has it changed in your perspective? What are these auditors now looking for in 2024, 2025 that they weren't necessarily looking for back in 2015?
Our latest version of our standards was published in 2023, and they're revised every 5 years and republished every 5 years. So prior to 2023, the latest version was 2018. 2018 was instrumental because when it came to critical devices, there was a clause that came out that critical devices must be sterilized if they can be. And in that list of devices, it stipulated bronchoscopes and cystoscopes specifically. So we always know when a clause is changed in the standards, we know that, if it's a should this year, the next time it's going to be a shall. And so it's important to really understand that terminology a little bit because they kind of sound the same and they can be misconstrued to be the same. But the should is a suggestion, a recommendation, rather than the shall is mandatory and it's a requirement. So that was in 2018. So now our latest version of standards that came out in 2023, now within those critical devices are now bronchoscopes, cystoscopes, laryngoscopes, ureteroscopes. And now where it said they shall be sterilized, period. So now there's no more of this. If it cannot be, it's just removed and now it's expected. Let's go. We're sterilizing all those scopes.
Okay. So you're starting to see a very clear trend. The writing is on the wall and in the standards now that says that
no
sterilization. Right.
That's
Yeah. That's very, very interesting because we're not quite seeing that yet here in the U.S., Stacy. Like, even though the writing is still on the wall, our standards, and again, this is kind of just the process that we lived under, but it takes a while to get everyone together, to have the debate, to get the data out on the table, and to make these updates that Melody's mentioning. And their standards are updated every 5 years. Our U.S. standards, like there's different timelines, but it still takes a while to get standards updated. Are you seeing a similar trajectory here in the U.S.? And even, most recently, like we're talking about clinician standards, but are you seeing any other emerging standards around the design of the endoscopes themselves, or even like that reprocessing validation piece?
Oh, yeah. So now we are starting to see, what has been, working in the field, we do have, say, for example, urology clinics, which are moving to, or groups that are moving to sterilization. That's just an example where they are moving to transitioning, training their teams, purchasing the sterilizers and moving to sterilization. So, that's quite a practice change for a clinic setting that's been doing high level disinfection, even if they've had, automated endoscope reprocessors now, but you're moving into sterilization, which requires a whole nother knowledge base and practice. But we are seeing that slowly kind of evolve, certainly in hospitals, transitioning those endoscopes to maybe sterile processing occasionally, where they're moving those to sterile processing. Again, you're opening up lots of discussion around turnover, right? And moving, if I'm going to send my equipment, my endoscopes away to a central sterile processing department, am I going to get them back when I need them? That kind of thing. But the change then is also, there is the future now has coming to us where we're having the multi-channel gastrointestinal endoscopes are going to be, the ability to sterilize them is here. And so as that is new to the industry, and we're going to start, that will be the new conversations that are going to start. How will we transition that? So, really moving now to the gastroenterology lab, the GI lab, or, the endoscopy department that hasn't had that ability before. So endoscope manufacturers are creating the possibility, work to sterilize those devices.
Right. And I guess it's an interesting technology trend, right? Because historically, if you go back far enough, we did have capabilities for sterilizing endoscopes through ethylene oxide sterilization, but it was an onerous process. It was many times potentially could be a dangerous process just due to exposure. And it was a time process. Back to your comment about the turnover. There is no turnover if you're sterilizing with EO just because of how long it takes, for that process and the off-gassing for safety. So it went through that cycle of we had capabilities. EO had a huge dive in just the availability and the commonality of the practice out there in the industry. And so then it's that really your only options were high level disinfection. Now we're seeing technology come back into the industry, to your point, Stacy, that can sterilize and can do it in a way that solves all of the other challenges that we had in the past, which is going to change practice. So let me come back to you, Stacy, with a quick question that Melanie will come next to you. If you're changing practice in this way, because now you've got like a generation or two of endoscope reprocessing techs, of clinics, of sterile processing techs who have never sterilized these scopes, and now they're going to have the opportunity to sterilize. How is that going to change that workflow, and how are we going to navigate the complexity of those changes?
Well, first of all, I think, again, it starts with the multidisciplinary group looking at everything. Really, your infection preventionists along with your reprocessing teams and, your team then that's working, as you mentioned, at techs that have been doing manual cleaning and high-level disinfection of the endoscopes, bringing everybody together, talking about, again, evidence-based, why is sterilization preferred? The extra margin of safety we have for patients with sterilization. Endoscopes are dried and packaged and they're patient ready, less chance for contamination. So all of those, bringing those understanding of the why behind why we would need to do this. And even with your physicians. Because then you bring your practitioners in, especially if you're talking about a service that has had physicians that, this is going to, what kind of costs are these, going to incur as well, right? But you've got this multidisciplinary group making the baseline understanding, and then moving forward, it is going to be a transition in not just training to a different process, but it's also in the space where you're working, having the right amount of storage, having the supplies you're going to need. I mean, all of this is a completely different, there's lots of things to consider. So you want to have those all discussed up front. So from our, where we're coming from, we're working with a manufacturer that we don't want to just be, here's your sterilizer, goodbye. That's not going to help anybody, I mean, so there is a big process around that, and your manufacturers of your equipment can also help with that, right? So oftentimes if there's a big training, it's the endoscope manufacturers along with the sterilizer manufacturer, we're all there to kind of help usher in these changes.
Okay, that's an important point because we've talked a little bit about that multidisciplinary kind of implementation group, if you will, in the hospital, but that's typically made up of hospital employees, right? That's IP, that's quality, that's risk, that's managers of these departments, technicians. But you brought up the other point. It's probably a good idea to have manufacturers involved from the device side, from the reprocessing, the sterilization side as well, to bring them in, especially around the training piece, to make sure that everyone is trained thoroughly enough to the why behind the change in process and how it's going to impact. I think that's a great point. Melanie, you referenced, 2018, 2023, like some of these conversations were already starting to happen in Canada. So perhaps you're a little further down the road, but I'll let you tell me, are you starting to see the impact of these changes kind of hit these Canadian departments yet? And if so, what are you seeing that has been working well to navigate the complexities to not have any big challenges along the way as we change the process?
Good question. To be honest, because it came out in 2018, so that big change has already kind of been taking place and it was well received as well. I think it it kind of fell into place quite nicely. Sterilization isn't too complicated, especially when we're talking about hydrogen peroxide gas plasma technology. It's relatively simple. It could be a lot easier than some steps of the endoscope reprocessing steps. So
yeah,
overall,
the 130 steps.
Yes, exactly. So overall, I think, that piece was a little bit easier to digest. But let's be honest, change is difficult. Change is always met with a little bit of resistance as well. We were just talking about costs before. Costs are always the biggest problem. Space is always a massive problem as well. Even like some of the bigger centers, if they're built on really highly dense and already developed areas, it can be difficult to build on top of that. And as we know, changes are never simple. They're never straightforward. They're never, an easy transition. So they can seem endless, right? And they can take so long to take place. And as I mentioned before, because those standards are constantly evolving and growing, we know that in 5 years, maybe something else will change. So that can lead to a lot of feelings of frustration for some of the staff as well, because you feel like you're always in repair or under construction, right? In a sense of speaking, right? So those are emotions that can be met with a little bit of resistance, right? And frustration. But I agree with Stacy. Support and education are essential to any smooth transition and any major change. And let's be honest, our reprocessing technicians and workers, they're super diligent workers. We're very passionate about their work. They're really the unsung heroes of infection control. So I agree that education and support is really the biggest element that they can have to really ease and have a successful change.
Why am I not surprised a couple of clinical education consultants end up saying education is a big part of the answer?
Just a little biased.
That's right. No, ladies, I absolutely agree. This conversation, I think, was a terrific introduction, not only an introduction, but a good refresher for anybody that's been in this reprocessing life cycle in the last 5, 10, 20 years because of exactly what you just said, Melanie. These are always changing. And if you're looking down and you're reprocessing the same way that you've been reprocessing the last 15 years, the change has probably passed you by. So take this episode to heart and go out there to many of those documents, organizations that Stacy listed earlier in the interview and start refreshing. Go do the search for the FDA warning letters or the recommendations that came out. Look at the new multi-societal guidelines and the conversation that was happening back and forth with other organizations. All those things matter, but you can't keep up with the change unless you're aware of what's happening out there. And then again, as we get new products and technologies inside our departments that change our process, you have got to keep up with those as well. So ladies, thank you so much for your time today. Terrific introduction. We're going to have your contact information in the show notes in case people have additional questions, which they very well might, so they can reach out to you directly. And we'll keep this conversation going so that we can have safer scopes in the days and years to come.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, that was Melanie Marshall and Stacy Johnson, and you've been listening to the Safe and Sterile Endoscope series, sponsored by ASP and produced by the Beyond Clean podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and as we remind you each and every week here at Beyond Clean, keep fighting dirty.